ever greater, Wes Moore.
Sorry. Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you very much, Elliot, to the whole Aspen Ideas Festival and Walter for the invitation. And whoever was in charge of scheduling and wanted to humble me by asking me to go after a Supreme Court justice, I appreciate that as well. I hope you all don't decide to completely book out and leave now that he's complete. But it's a real honor to be here, and it's interesting because that actually reminds me of a very quick story. When I first was putting together the book that I wrote is called The Other Wes Moore, and when I first put together this book, and a dirty little secret about publishing, and I'm sure 90% of people in here are published themselves, so they know that basically what's inside of a book is all author. That's the author's words, those are the author's thoughts. What's on the outside, the cover, the title, that's a lot publisher, because that's the publisher's chance to market. And so when the publisher starts having conversations with their authors about what do they want the cover to look like and the title to look like, in many cases, it's almost ceremonial. They're doing it because they're being nice, right? And so I was having a conversation with my publisher, our ceremonial conversation about what they thought the title of this book should be. And I had 5 or 6 ideas that I thought were really good, that I wanted for this book. And they were like, so what do you think? And I came up, I was like, what about Out of Many? Or what about Baltimore Suns? Or what about All the Difference? And I had all these different names. And they looked at me and they were like, those are interesting. And they said, well, we have an idea for you. What do you think about The Other Wes Moore? And as soon as they said it, I thought to myself, and I looked at them and I said, that is the dumbest book title that I've ever heard in my life. And I said it for a bunch of reasons. And they said, what do you think, what's wrong with it? And I said, well, there's a bunch, but let me give you 3. First thing, I've been very clear that I wanted the intent of this book that people understand that it's not just about these 2 boys, but it's really about a societal conversation. And so by putting the name in the title, aren't you completely negating that entire argument? The second thing I said, I don't know what author puts their name inside of their own book title. It sounds ridiculous. And the third thing I said, no one knows who one Wes Moore is, so I don't know why anyone would care who the other Wes Moore is. And they looked at me and they said, that's interesting, we get that point. But the problem is I think you're missing the point. The problem is that you're right. This isn't about you, and it's not about him. The name isn't important. You can throw any name inside of that title. And the fact remains there are Wes Moores of both sides that exist in each and every one of our communities. The most important thing about the title is the other. The other. The fact that our society is full of others. Many people who haven't made it to Aspen during this week. Many people who will walk by and not think much about their life, their circumstances, and their challenges. Or many people, we look at their final life conclusion and never once think about how they got there, positive or negative. And the thing that I try to uncover, and the thing I really learned for myself with that was the more we actually try to uncover that, the more we realize how little separates us from another life altogether. And the story in the background of it really begins with an article from the Baltimore Sun, which is my hometown paper. And the Baltimore Sun wrote a piece, this was back in 2000. I just received a Rhodes Scholarship. And the Baltimore Sun wrote a piece about my life and my childhood and how I was a local kid who had just received this award. But in the article, they went a little bit deeper, not just talking about the award, but talking also about my background. And in the article, they talked a little bit about how some of the challenges that I had growing up and how a lot of them stem from what happened with my father. I only have 2 memories of my father. The first memory of my father was once when I was about 3 years old. One thing about my mother was always very insistent on the fact that men never put their hands on women. And she made sure that her son never put his hand on a woman as well. So I swear, as early as when I was in a bassinet, this was lessons that she was telling me. And my older sister, who was about 5 years older than me, I have a younger sister and an older sister. My older sister, we would have these little sibling games that sometimes we're joking around, sometimes we're not, but sometimes ended in physical confrontations. It's like siblings do. And I didn't realize that my mother's insistence on why men never put their hands on women came from her personal past, was the fact that she was mentally and physically and sexually abused. So she always said, I will never tolerate it if I see it, and I particularly will never tolerate it if I see it in my own son. And so one day, I was playing around with my sister. She was blowing in my face, and I was laughing. And again, she's about 9 years old this time. I'm 3 years old, blowing in my face. And then eventually I just get up and I start running after her. And once I finally catch her, I turn around and I pull my fist back and I swing and I hit her. And I hit her in the arm. But as soon as I made contact, I turned around and I saw my mom. And I knew it was about to get real bad. And so my mother then starts yelling after me, telling me to go to my room. I immediately run up to my room. And again, when she's like, you don't put your hands on women, I would always try to explain to her that this is not a woman. This is Nikki. This is my sister. This is totally different. But my mother didn't see the difference. So as I'm up in my room, and we had a small house down in Maryland, and we had like a crib and a bed where myself and my sister sat. And I started hearing footsteps coming up the stairs. And then I heard a knock on the door, and the door opened up, and my father walked into the room. And my father had a very calming, a very soothing presence to him. He was tall, but never rose his voice. And he came into my room, and he sat down on the bed, and he picked me up, and he put me on his lap. And he started explaining to me why my mother was so mad, explaining to me that, I needed to protect my family, and I should never, ever attack women, and explained to me why she was so upset. And then at the end of it, he explained to me that I needed to go downstairs and I needed to apologize to my mother and apologize to my sister, and he was going to go with me. He picks me up, we're walking down the stairs, and the whole time as we're walking down the stairs together, my whole hand wrapped around his finger, literally and figuratively. And as we're walking down the stairs, he's looking down at me and I'm looking up at him. And I remember just trying to copy the way that he walked, the way that his chest stuck out, the way that his head held high. And I did the same thing. And my father was my hero. He was everything I wanted to be. And the only other memory that I have of him was a little less than a year later was when I watched him die. And at 3.5 years old, when you hear that your father passed away, you have no idea what that means. I kept on hearing that he moved on to a better place, and the only thing that I was concerned about was when was he coming back here. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that he wasn't. And a lot of that frustration, a lot of that confusion eventually turned to anger. It turned to apathy. It turned to the point that eventually I was picking and choosing which days I wanted to go to school. It came to the point that by the time I was 8 and 9 years old, I was already on academic and disciplinary probation. By the time I was 11, it got worse. By the time I was 11 was the first time that I felt handcuffs clasped around my wrists at 11 years old. But then through a lot of help and a lot of intervention and a lot of people who refused to give up on me, I was able to help change direction, change azimuth. And the Baltimore Sun wrote a little bit about this story and about how I just received this award. Now, at the same time, the Baltimore Sun was also writing a whole series of articles on 4 guys who one day walked into a jewelry store. 2 guys, when they walked into the jewelry store, as soon as they walked in at 11:30 in the morning, they reached in their coats and they pulled out guns. And as they reached and they pulled out guns, they started pointing the guns at everybody who was inside the store, either shopping or working, and telling everybody to hit the ground and keep their hands on top of their heads. And about 10 seconds later, 2 other guys walked into the store, and they reached in their coats and they pulled out mallets. And one guy with a gun and one guy with a mallet went to the left, and one guy with a gun and one guy with a mallet went to the right. The ones with the guns were keeping everybody on the ground, while the ones with the mallets were walking around and just smashing out jewelry cases and taking out watches and rings and necklaces. And they met in the back of the store with a little over $400,000 worth of jewelry. And one of the guys yelled, "Let's go." And then all 4 then ran out of the center of the store and ran out to the adjacent parking lot. One of the people that was inside the store that day was an off-duty police officer who was moonlighting as a security guard. He was a 13-year veteran of the Baltimore Police Force. He was a 3-time recipient of Police Officer of the Year. He was a father of 5 who just had triplets. And the reason he was working that day was because it was his day off from the police force, and he had to work a second job to make extra money for his family. And he got up off the ground, and he drew his weapon, and he ran outside to the adjacent parking lot to see if he could stop the guys from getting away. And as he ran outside, he started kneeling next to cars and kneeling next to vehicles to see if he could figure out which vehicle that they were in. And he didn't realize that one of the vehicles that he was kneeling next to was one of the vehicles that the guys were in. And then a window rolled down, and then 3 shots were taken at point-blank range. 2 hit him in the chest, 1 hit him in the head, and he was killed instantly. And there was a 12-day national manhunt for those 4 guys, and finally after 12 days, all 4 guys were caught. And one of the people that the police were looking for, one of the people that was eventually caught, tried, convicted, and sentenced for the crime, was a guy whose name was also Wes Moore. And the more I learned about this tragedy, this police officer who went to work one day and didn't come home, the more I read articles about this story and the more they detailed the people who were involved, the more I realized how much more that Wes and I had in common than just our names. I found out that we were living in the same neighborhood, literally at that time, blocks away from each other. That we both grew up in single-parent households. We both had academic and disciplinary probation growing up. We were around the same age. And so that's when I started thinking to myself, so how does this happen? How do you get 2 kids from similar backgrounds and similar circumstances who end up going in 2 completely different places, that as I'm getting ready to head off 3,000 miles away from home on a scholarship, he's getting ready to head it to 25 miles away from home to a maximum security facility for the rest of his life. Him, his older brother, and the 2 other guys who were convicted that day. And I knew there were questions I wanted to ask, and I knew that Wes was the only one that could answer them, so one day I just decided to write him. I had no idea if he'd write back, and quite honestly, I knew I couldn't control what Wes did, but I wrote him a note. And then a month later, I received a letter back from Jessup Correctional Institution from Wes Moore. And it's one of these things that if that letter that I received from Wes was, written in crayon, like he wrote it with his whole hand and it didn't make any sense, if that was a letter I would have received, I would have looked at that letter and said, okay, I get it. I have a better understanding of what happened. The problem is that it wasn't. The problem is, to this day, it was one of the most interesting and articulate letters that I've ever received, where the first thing he did was he first thanked me for writing him, because he says, when you're in prison, you think that the whole world doesn't think you exist anymore. And then he started answering all the questions that I posed to him. And eventually that one letter turned into dozens of letters. Those dozens of letters turned into dozens of visits. And now I've known Wes for around 8 years. And when I first started going through this process, I had known Wes for years before the idea of a book came about. But after speaking with Wes about it, he said something I thought was interesting. He said, listen, I've wasted every opportunity I've ever had in life. And if you can do something to help people understand the consequences for their decisions, and also do something to help people understand the neighborhoods that these decisions are being made in, then you should do it. And that then became the fire and the motivation behind this whole project. The idea of this was never to cast revisionist history. The idea of this was never to open appeal processes or anything like that. Wes's fate is sealed. But the question I wanted to ask was, why was his fate sealed so long before February 7 of 2000? And what I wanted to try to figure out is, what is that thing that if we can give kids, that kids will be just fine? If we can get them that one thing, that I know they'll be okay. And the takeaway that I took from this entire experience of doing hundreds of hours of interviews and speaking with everyone who would talk to me, his friends, his family, my family, etc., was I realized there is no one thing. Raising kids is extraordinarily complicated. And when you happen to have to raise kids in some of the most dangerous and precarious neighborhoods in our country, it becomes that much more complicated. But I do know a couple things that do matter. One thing that matters is education matters. And not simply because, even if you take it away from the boys, take it back a generation to the mothers. Wes's mother was the first one in her family to go to college. She graduated with honors from Baltimore City Community College and gets accepted to Johns Hopkins University. First one in her family. And one day she receives a letter indicating that her grants were cut and she could no longer afford to go to school. Now, I can't help but think how different her life could have turned out and would have turned out had she had the chance to finish school. Not just because of what you learn and not just because of the piece of paper that you can hang up and frame on your wall, but because with higher education, your networks change, your friendships change, your connections change. I know if I took a quick straw poll, I'd be the first one to raise my hand to say how many people with the job you either have or a job you've had in recent history that you did not get that job through the classified ads or Monster.com. Because that's not the way it works for 70% of people in this country. For 70% of people in this country, you get a phone call or an email from someone who says, we have a mutual friend, I'm looking for someone that can do X, Y, and Z, and they mentioned you. Or you call somebody who says, I'm interested in getting into your field, can you teach me a little bit about it? And next thing you know, that's how the ball starts rolling. Education matters not just because of what you learn, but who you're learning it from. I also know that environment matters. And it's not that I think that the answer is picking kids up from one environment and throwing them to another environment, because that's not the answer. In fact, if supports aren't in place, that actually compounds the problem. The best way you can help a child is by making sure they're coming up in a strong, supportive home. The best way you help that home is by making sure that home exists in a strong, supportive community. The best way you do that is making sure you have anchor educational institutions in that community. But that environment matters because when you think, even as we're having all these larger conversations about education reform, which are incredibly important conversations that we're having now, the three things that keep children from reading at grade level by third grade, the three things are summer learning loss, chronic absence, which is defined as kids who are missing 30% or more of the school year, and kids who are entering school unprepared. All three of those things have nothing to do with structural school reform. Environment matters because parents have to understand their job. They are their child's first and best teacher. But helping parents understand, because one thing I believe about parents is not that a lot of parents don't care. It's that a lot of them don't know. They don't know why it's important to read to your child as early as when they're in utero. They don't know why it's important to describe things to your child when you're talking about the sky, that it's not just the sky, but it's the blue sky, to making sure that they're entering school with a strong vocabulary. That kind of stuff matters. And the third thing that I know that matters is expectations matter. I remember when I was speaking with Wes about Baltimore, and I asked him, I said, so do you think that we're products of our environment? And Wes looked back at me and he said, actually, I think we're products of our expectations. And I thought to myself, he's absolutely right. We're not products of our environments, we're products of our expectations. But the thing about expectations is that expectations aren't born from nowhere. The expectations that we have for ourselves, the expectations that all young people have for themselves, they're born from the expectations that other people place on them. They're born from what other people see in their future. And that's how it begins to formulate. We're a country full of self-fulfilling prophecies. And I remember someone once said to me, it's a real shame that you lived up to your expectations and Wes didn't. And I said, actually, the real shame is that we both lived up to our expectations. We both ended up exactly where we thought we would. These things matter when we're talking about how do we develop a stronger, more secure society. Because the greatest battles that we're going to fight as a country will never be outside. And I'm saying this as a veteran. But they're within. They're how much intellectual capital are we driving from areas where the expectations are not just externally but internally so low. What I'd like to do very briefly is just close with a small part of the book. One thing I heard that authors do is read parts of their books, so I guess I should do it. But it's a very small part. It says, things have not been perfect for me in the years since the book's story ended. Like many boys who grew up without a father in the home, I searched for ways to fill that hole, sometimes in places I shouldn't have looked. I made some tremendous mistakes along the way. I've done things I deeply regret, said things I wish I could take back, and disappointed people in ways that still embarrass me. I have fought battles I should not have engaged in and walked away from causes that needed and deserved a champion. But I've had the freedom to make those mistakes and the freedom to seek redemption for them. When we're young, it sometimes seems as if the world doesn't exist outside our city, our block, our house, our room. We make decisions based on what we see in that limited world and follow the only models available. The most important thing that happened to me was not being physically transported. The moves from Baltimore to the Bronx to Valley Forge didn't change my way of thinking. What changed was that I found myself surrounded by people, starting with my mom, grandparents, uncles, and aunts, and leading to a string of wonderful role models and mentors who kept pushing me to see more than what was directly in front of me, to see the boundless possibilities of the wider world and the unexplored possibilities within myself. People who taught me that no accident of birth, not being black or relatively poor, being from Baltimore or the Bronx or fatherless, would ever define me or limit me. In other words, they helped me to discover what it means to be free. As I wrote at the outset of this book, the chilling truth is that Wes's story could have been mine. The tragedy is that my story could have been his. My only wish, and I know Wes feels the same, is that the boys and girls who come after us will know this same freedom. It's up to us, all of us, to make a way for them.
Fashion, which sounds a little bit like